Hi everyone. This presentation will focus on color, specifically on how complementary colors can be used hand in hand, along with other values and chromatic neutrals to create a complex sense of color in a work of art. First, I want to talk about James Abbott McNeill Whistler, who was an incredible painter who was way ahead of his time. He was a part of Britain's 19th century aesthetic movement that had a huge focus on thinking about art just for the sake of art. This was in response to the French Revolution and an attempt to embrace individuality, equality, and justice. Notice his nocturnal color scheme, the variations of blue and orange, and how they fill the composition, capturing light with a wide variety of variations in tone, value, and color that make up this abstract, yet at the same time representational landscape. Whistler was working at the same time as Degas, Monet, Courbet, and Seurat. Some of them were buddies. Making work like this, including splatter painting techniques, was pretty revolutionary for the time. This was much more abstract than most people were used to seeing in art. Next, let's look at some work by John Singer Sargent on the right. Notice all the variations of neutral green and purple and yellow that are shown in the tent itself. These neutral moments in the background and the surface that these hospital beds are on capture such a rich sense of a chromatic neutral that's complementary in many cases to some of the more saturated focal points, like the red hospital beds. This contrast in saturation helps with the atmospheric perspective of the scene. This creates more depth, allowing our eye to go back further into space. John Singer Sargent's watercolors are absolutely beautiful and incredibly inspiring to look at for having a really complex sense of color that's naturalistic while also incredibly expressive. During World War I, John Singer Sargent was commissioned by the British government to paint at military camps. This also took place during the 1918 influenza pandemic, which John Singer Sargent actually came down with while painting here at this military camp. Here's another work by John Singer Sargent. Notice how the reds and purples in the water have yellow and green counterpoints, warm counterpoints, over on the other side of this composition. Notice how the really sort of red-pink, sort of really hot skin tone looks even more red because of the greens around it. Here's another by John Singer Sargent because he's just the master of chromatic neutrals. Look at those shadows. Notice how the shadow shifts in color as the surface that they're on changes. The purple and yellow are working together in order to create a beautiful, beautiful contrast and saturated hue. Even the background, which is mostly a warm brown, has a deep, cool purple underneath it, which helps to sort of create a lot more tension in the background, even though it's a relatively dark, neutral space in the painting. Here's another watercolor by John Singer Sargent. Check out the light blue purples in the shadows of these white fabrics. They make the surrounding warm oranges and greens feel even more striking. Chromatic neutrals can do so much in a painting. Whenever you have a shadow or a neutral tone to paint, I challenge you to think about John Singer Sargent and reach for a color that's on the other side of the color wheel, but that's very specific based on what you need. We're going to look at Henry Osawa Tanner once more because his use of chromatic neutrals is absolutely stunning. Check out, in this painting on the left, how the orange and blue in the background, the very, very light pastel tones, are such beautiful chromatic neutrals that are so vivid, especially in contrast to the really deep purples and light beiges in the foreground. In this work on the right, check out the different tones that he uses in the ground as well as the shadows of the architecture. They almost get more vivid as they go back into the shadows because everything else is pretty washed out from the very bright beaming light. Here Marc Chagall is using a color scheme of green and red in so many variations with cool neutrals and indigo to sort of counterpoint the bright yellow in this one focal point of the bouquet. Now let's look at some work by Henri Matisse. This composition on the left, which is mostly a teal green and pink composition, has a lot of other things going on. This brown in the trees and this gray over here really tie together all of the other colors that are going on in the composition. Because brown is a combination of multiple different tones, same thing with gray, it's helpful because it really sort of allows there to be something in common between all of the tones that are there, including the yellow. It's really prominent in the bottom left corner. This painting on the right really kind of shows how sometimes having just one color dominate your color scheme can be really effective. There's a variety of different tones that draw your eye in as a saturated focal point. This painting on the left, the Red Studio, is an incredibly red painting. This deep brick red dominates the composition, while many other different tones are scattered throughout. Check out this warm green contour line that leads you through almost every object in this composition. These complementary tones create this incredible visual vibration, especially because of how thin the line is and how complementary the tones are, even while being pretty neutral. Matisse had no problem with his paintings feeling flat, but instead really focused on color and composition. Now let's look at some of my very favorite female surrealists. On the left is a painting by Dorothea Tanning. This painting oscillates between warm and cool very subtly, but generally has lots and lots of green and pink moving you throughout the composition. Overall, her color palette is very neutral and pastel. On the right, we have a work by Kay Sage. Her husband, Yves Tanguy, was also an incredibly famous surrealist. This very neutral green composition has this very central red focal point. This focal point is surrounded by complementary neutral tones, mostly neutral greens. Also notice how this very subtle, incredibly atmospheric light purple creates atmospheric perspective as it goes back into the distance. Notice how the most high contrast elements are up closer to the viewer. Here's some work by one of my very favorite artists, Remedios Varo. She was a Spanish and Mexican surrealist painter who would channel the unconscious mind by creating these incredible narratives with vivid, lush color schemes and just beautiful paint application. In the painting on the left, she has a color scheme built out of red and orange and blue and green. Notice how she's created transparency, where each one of these sort of columns in this interesting egg-shaped boat feel like they're submerged in this water that's moving through the composition. She did this through a combination of opaque and transparent painting. In this painting, we also have brown functioning as a color that ties together the rest of the tones in the color scheme. Because brown contains each one of the tones that she painted with for the bright red and orange and blues and greens, these browns are incredibly important in grounding this color scheme and allowing them to feel complex but also unified. I could stare at her paintings for hours and hours, so I'm just going to let you sit with this painting on the right for a moment. Such good stuff. Similar to the last two paintings we saw, this painting also has a red and green color scheme. These very specific tones create an overall very warm composition. Notice how this light blue section really stands out as the coolest part of the painting. Also, the figure's eye and the gaze really leads the viewer's eye directly over into this blue section. Next, we have some work by Peter Doig, a contemporary painter who often paints incredibly, almost haunting landscapes with figuration. Notice this blue, green, and red-orange complementary relationship going on in this composition. Notice how important chromatic black is for creating moments of core shadows beneath the canoe, also in the garment of the figure, and the faraway island. Because green is basically a warmer version of a blue, that island in the back, the green really ties the vivid orange in with the blue. Next, we'll look at some works by Jordan Castile, an amazing artist who's originally from Denver. currently working in New York. She had a show at the Denver Art Museum last year that was really incredible. Her work highlights the experiences of Black people and other people of color in her community. Notice how this gold green in the figure's garments and backpack is such a beautiful complement to the warm oranges and reds beside him. Also notice how she's using darker tones to balance out the top right and the lower part of the composition. In this work on the right, you can see these gold oranges and their lavender counterparts. Also notice, in the buildings in the back of the painting, how she allows her underpainting to show through in her final product. These fresh marks add to the overall variety in visual language that she uses in her work. This work is by Matthew Wong. He was an incredible self-taught contemporary painter. The sliver of dark blue at the horizon line and the beautiful neutral green blue above it are such amazing complements to the red-orange that makes up most of the painting below it. Also notice how the blue and green marks that are within this red section create such an incredible sense of pattern and contrast. They create this interesting visual vibration between the two complements. That's so exciting to look at. The next work is by Onondaga and Nez Perce artist Frank Buffalohide. This work is in response to the occupation of Standing Rock in 2007. You can see here the military using LRADs, or sonic weapons, as a violent tactic against the Standing Rock Sioux tribe and other protesters. Placing this scene within a snow globe, I feel adds a different element of meaning to this work. The high contrast blue and orange, to me, reflects the urgency of this moment. Notice how he pulls grays and browns and variations of tones, which help to tie together dramatic complements. The last artist we'll look at is Emma Amos, a contemporary figurative painter who pulls from her heritage by using African fabrics for borders, along with her vividly beautiful renderings of people and their landscapes. The colors almost feel neon to me because of the very specific choices and how they're placed next to one another in these particular arrangements. In this work on the right, I think it's so interesting how it feels so much about textiles, in that the way that this figure is pulling on a fabric from inside the painting. Also in the way the surface treatment of the figure feels like that of tie-dye. To me, this piece draws on the idea that textiles can hold such personal and cultural significance. Well, that's it for now. I hope you found this presentation to be inspiring. You can always look back on some of these artists if you ever need to pull some inspiration for color. Hope you have a great week.